Hi, my name is Deborah Dilley, and I am with the Utah Coalition Against Sexual Assault, and I'd really like to thank the Utah Parent Center for having me come out to talk about this topic. This presentation I call The Hidden Victim, Abuse of People with Disabilities, and this is a topic that's kind of close to my heart. I've been with the Utah Coalition now since 2010, and I'm our outreach person, but I also handle a lot of our financial management as well. And prior to that, I did a lot of community outreach with the Middle East Center, working with teachers and the community at large. But even before that, I've actually been volunteering and working with the community of people with disabilities since I was 15 years old. So we will not disclose how old I am, but it's been over 15 years. And I used to work with Easter Seals back when they offered respite services, and so now with my work at the Coalition, it's nice to be able to find a place where I can take this knowledge base that I have and this family that I have that are in this population of people with disabilities and kind of work to create some system-wide change. So today what we're going to be covering is quite a lot. There's a lot on this learning objective slide. First, I'm going to talk a little bit more about what UCASA does. We'll talk about some basic definitions of sexual violence, talk about some sexual violence statistics, and then we'll go into some statistics for survivors with disabilities. What we found is that I could come into any sort of training situation and tell you a lot of information about working specifically with victims who have disabilities, but if you don't have an idea of the overarching problem of sexual violence, you're going to be missing a huge piece of that. So that's why we do focus on that in this training. We'll also talk a little bit about prevention versus risk reduction and what those are and what those programs look like. We'll talk about some barriers for victims to disclose abuse that happens. We'll discuss consent. We will talk about signs and symptoms of abuse, mandatory reporting laws, and what to do when you suspect abuse is happening. And then as we wrap up this presentation, we're going to dispel some common rape myths, because that's also a factor that comes into play with understanding all of the dynamics of sexual violence, is some of the misconceptions that people have about what sexual violence is and what it is not. So the Utah Coalition Against Sexual Assault, or for short UCASA, was founded in 1996 as a nonprofit agency in Utah, and we are dedicated to supporting programs that provide direct services to survivors of sexual violence through technical assistance and training. What does that mean? It's kind of a fancy way of saying that while we may not provide direct victim services, we provide the training and assistance for anybody, any agency in the state that comes in contact with victims. So if it's law enforcement, if it's rape crisis programs, if it's hospital emergency room staff, if it's teachers, anybody that could come in contact with a victim, we're there to provide training and resources for. And we do that through a variety of different programs. One is that we are the provider of the statewide mandated 40-hour rape and sexual assault advocacy training. This advocacy training is required for those that work in rape crisis programs, and it gives them confidential communicator status, which means that when a victim comes into their agency and talks about their experience, that information stays private and cannot be called into a court of law. And it's a protection that is very vital for survivors being able to open up and talk about what happened. The other programs that we have in our organization is we have a rural services coordination. Utah is a very rural state, and we operate throughout the state, not just in the Wasatch Front. And so there's different issues that come into play the more remote areas are. So what happens in Salt Lake City, for example, is not going to be the same conditions that are going to happen if someone is presenting to law enforcement in Kanab, for example. So we have our training and professional development program, which our outreach program is part of, and I'm here as part of our outreach. We have prevention programs that go into schools to talk to children about having healthy relationships and to coordinate that. We have a membership program. We also have a coordinator who works strictly with our sexual assault nurse examiners, and we call those SANEs for short. And what that coordinator does is she makes sure that all of the nurses throughout the state that provide the rape exams, which are called Code Rs, has access to the same quality of training and the same quality of equipment. We also have a sexual assault response team coordinator who works with first responders throughout the state to create protocols that are victim-centered, that will work for the communities that they serve. And then we have some survivor-led initiatives like the Men's Anti-Violence Network that are trying to draw on grassroots and community organizations to help continue doing this work. We also do a lot with collaborating. We have several collaborative partnerships because we don't need to recreate the wheel. We should work with agencies that are already doing this work and try to enhance their services. We also talk to the state legislature, so you don't have to, although we always appreciate help with legislative help. And then when there is situations in which the system breaks down, where if a victim goes and reports to law enforcement and it ends up horribly wrong, we can come in and work with the law, in this particular example, say a law enforcement agency, and find out what happened in the breakdown in their protocols and make sure that they have the support and training so that this doesn't happen again to another victim. So we have a lot that we do, and we're just one tiny little office with a very large mission. So moving on to the main part here, what is sexual violence? In general, sexual violence occurs anytime a person is forced, coerced, and or manipulated into unwanted sexual contact, attempted or completed. I think there's a misconception in a lot of people's minds that if it was attempted, it really doesn't count as a sexual assault or goes under the umbrella of sexual violence, but it does. And sexual violence is a very large umbrella term that includes a lot of different types of crimes and different behaviors that can happen underneath them. So for example, underneath that sexual violence umbrella, we have rape, marital or partner rape, sodomy, incest, alcohol and drug facilitated sexual assault, child sexual abuse, statutory rape, which under Utah legal law code, it's actually called unlawful sexual activity with a minor, ritual abuse, sexual exploitation, human trafficking, sexual harassment, dating violence, stalking, molestation, fondling, sexual battery, which is unwanted touching, indecent exposure, and voyeurism. So you can see there's a lot of items that get included under that sexual violence umbrella, which is why it's important that I'm starting this training with giving you that information. We also need to realize that sexual violence is not a woman's issue. Oftentimes you hear it's a gender issue, but a lot of people still kind of assume that that means a woman's issue. It's not. It's a community issue. It affects all genders, all races, all facets of society. It affects their victims. It affects the families, their friends, their communities. It can happen to anyone at any time, anywhere. And sexual assault and sexual violence is destructive to those whose lives have been affected by it. It's a violent crime, and it affects our society. And many times in media or in any other kind of interactions with the community, we have a tendency to minimize the impact of sexual violence, and that's also destructive as well. So moving on to statistics, there's a lot of statistics about sexual violence, and so rather than bombard you with a whole bunch of statistics that really aren't going to be that helpful for you, I kind of tried to narrow the field down with just some of the more important ones for you. So we'll talk about first some statistics in the United States, then within Utah, and then we'll narrow that down even more to specific to victims who have disabilities. So in the United States, when you're using a definition of rape that includes forced vaginal, oral, and anal sex, 17% of surveyed women and 3% of surveyed men reported being victims of a completed or an attempted rape at some time in their lifetime. So this translates into 1 out of 6 U.S. women and 1 out of 33 U.S. men. Now that's actually just that particular number, the 1 in 6 and 1 in 33, pertains just to rape, just to penetration. Now when we open that up broader to include all the crimes under that spectrum of sexual violence, those numbers change. So it becomes 1 in 4 women and 1 in 7 men will be sexually assaulted during their lifetime. And that number is very different when we look at the Utah statistics. So in Utah, we have a lot of specific issues that affect what our numbers are. And our numbers for sexual violence are a lot higher than any other place in the country. For example, rape is the only category of violent crime in which Utah is exceeding that national average. This equates out to 34 forcible rapes per 100,000 residents within Utah versus 30 for the United States combined. One rape is reported every 9 hours, and according to a variety of other studies that we've done, we're only finding out that maybe in Utah 12% of all rapes and sexual assaults are being reported. So if we have only a small fraction that are being reported and they're happening every 9 hours, the problem is a lot more pervasive than a lot of people want to really recognize and take in. Our rate of rape in Utah, we're the 17th highest in the nation. We are higher than the state of New York. We are higher than Washington, D.C. We are higher than the entire state of California. And there's a lot of factors that contribute into that high number. Incidentally, the state that has the highest amount of rape and sexual assault is actually Alaska. When we look more into some of Utah's numbers, we have this amazing report called the Rape in Utah Report. It was done originally in 2005 and then repeated in 2007, and it's done by the Utah Department of Health. And when we repeated the study, we found that the numbers did not change, even though we had completely different respondents. So we actually believe this to be the clearest picture of what sexual violence looks like within the state. So some of the findings from this study was that 1 in 3 women will experience some form of sexual violence during their lives. So comparing that to the 1 in 4 nationally, we have 1 out of every 3 women will experience some form of sexual violence. We've also discovered that 78% experience their first sexual assault before their 18th birthday. One of the factors that we have within Utah that is contributing to the high rate of sexual violence that we have is that we have vulnerable populations. We have a lot of children in our population here. We also have large populations of elderly people and a large population of people who have disabilities. The more vulnerable populations you have within a society, the higher the likelihood is that you're going to have issues with rape and sexual assault. Only 12% of victims sought medical care after their attack, and only 11.8% reported to police. It's a slightly higher reporting rate than nationally, which is about 9 to 10%, but still that's a lot of individuals who are not reporting to the police that this particular crime has happened. 1% of all victims contacted a rape crisis center about their sexual assault. Only 1% of victims are seeking services, and of those 1%, only 32% are seeking counseling after the assault. So it's a lot of people who are hurt and a lot of people who aren't getting the help and assistance that they need. This number is also surprising for a lot of people because we have this idea that there is a particular type of rapist out there, and that it's the stranger that pops out of this alley that you happen to be in that's also behind bushes, and all these strange little ideas that we have. Only 13% were attacked by strangers. So this means that 87% of the Utah population that is a victim of rape and sexual assault, 87% know who their perpetrator is. It is somebody that they know, that they trust, that they may love. So this is a crime that's very, very close, and it's because of this closeness that we also have less reporting numbers, because people don't want to report or get in trouble the people that are close to them. We also need to understand that rape is not about sex. Yes, there is a sexual component to that. That cannot be denied, but that is not the purpose of what is happening behind rape. Rape is a crime of control and of violence. The underlying motive of the rapist is to express control, anger, hostility, insecurity, resentment. There's a very, very small fraction of rapists that actually do it because it's about sex. The majority it's all about expressing control. And so while there is the sexual component to it, it's the tool used to commit these crimes, not the motive. I like to equate it this way. If someone hits you over the head with a frying pan, you don't call that cooking. So when somebody attacks and sexually violates someone, it's not sex. It's not cooking. It's that same process. Another reason why we know that rape is not about sex and it's not about sex appeal is by actually talking to the rapists themselves. And we've discovered that most rapists can't recall what a victim was wearing at the time of the assault. So oftentimes it's, you hear this myth that it's the girl in the short skirt who's, out at a club that she shouldn't be at is the one who is going to get raped, and that's actually not it. That's not what rapists are looking for. Rapists are actually looking for vulnerability and opportunity. We also see this playing out in the numbers. So in the state of Utah, the oldest reported victim is was 95 years old. Unfortunately, she actually did die from her injuries. The youngest reported victim, and this was a penetration case, was 3 days old. And luckily that child did survive. But when you look at those numbers and you look at the variety of ages of the victims that you see, between 3 days to 95, this is not about sex appeal. This is about something much deeper than that. Now, looking on to statistics for survivors with a disability, I actually included this particular statistic first because I find this one to be the most heartbreaking. And for anyone who has close family members who is a person with a disability, this is one of those things that we worry about. So according to a 2007 National Crime Victimization Survey, nearly 1 in 5 violent crime victims with a disability believed that they became a victim because of their disability. Now, in general, as family members and allies, this is a population that we want to protect, and we want to think that nobody would ever hurt someone with a disability. But the sad thing is that it does happen. And the even sadder thing is that these victims know that their disability was the reason why, that this was a contributing factor that made them vulnerable. So I commend everybody for listening to this webinar today, because we want to change that system, and we want to make it so that we don't have these violent crime victims anymore, but we also don't want them to believe that they're being targeted for their disability. Some other statistics to consider is that children with disabilities are 2 to 4 times more likely to be victims of violence than children without disabilities. And according to 3 separate studies, as many as 40%, 75%, and 97% of assaults went unreported. Now, 3 separate studies with some very different statistics. One thing that we can take from this is that the data collection on this type of crime is not sufficient to actually be able to come up with good, solid numbers that we can work with. In any case, 1 assault is too many. But if we're having 40% unreported, 75% unreported, or 97% unreported, that's a lot of people who are not being able to get access to services and the help that they need in order to heal from this horrific crime. There's another study that suggests that 50 to 90% of people with disabilities are survivors of some sort of sexual violence. And then with our last statistic page, I'm sure people are like, yay, no more statistics. 97 to 99% of abusers are known and trusted by the victim who has a developmental disability. So when you compare that to 87% of the general population know their perpetrator, and you put that side by side with a person who has a developmental disability, and you have 97 to 99% of them know who their perpetrator is, that shows you that we have a very different issue. This is not strangers taking advantage of somebody. This is somebody who is very close, and oftentimes statistically we find out that it is caregivers, it is bus drivers, it is someone very close to that individual. Only 22% of alleged offenders were charged with the crime, and out of those charged, only 38% were convicted. This is also similar numbers to rape and sexual assault outside of the population of people with disabilities, and it should be more people charged. And part of it is our justice system. It's a criminal justice system. It's called criminal for a reason. And this is why we need to do these trainings like this, to get awareness out so that we can get more victims reporting. The more victims we have reporting, the more chances and opportunities we're going to have to get those rapists off the street and convicted and into jail where they belong. So one of the reasons why I was brought in to do this training was to talk about prevention. And I think we have to be very careful with the terms that we use, because oftentimes what we think is prevention is actually something called risk reduction. Now, the idea of prevention is it's seeking to prevent the overall occurrence of sexually abusive acts. So prevention really is stopping the perpetrator from perpetrating. This is by starting early, talking about communication, healthy behaviors, because ultimately the only person that can prevent a rape or sexual assault from happening is the rapist. And they prevent that from happening by making the decision not to commit rape. So when we talk about risk reduction, that's actually lessening one's risk of sexual victimization. So this is kind of like the checklists when people have, when you go out and you're trying to make sure you don't get mugged, for example, you know that you have your keys with you, you have your money hidden, that you're in well-lit places. Those are all risk factors that you're trying to reduce. Has nothing to do with prevention, because we ultimately know in a mugging situation, the only person who can actually prevent the mugging from happening is the mugger not mugging. And that's the same thing with rape and sexual assault. So prevention programs that we work with, they focus on teaching children to respect the physical boundaries of others and to refrain from unwanted touching. So that's primary prevention. Now, a risk reduction program would be an educational program that's teaching children about their personal boundaries and how to say no to unwanted touching. So it's a very different viewpoint. One, it's affecting, trying to stop possible perpetration. The other view is to kind of do that follow-up of, after that perpetration has been decided upon, how that person can reduce their risk of further harm. In prevention, the only person that can prevent is the rapist. I'm going to say that like 100 times. You'll get used to it soon. And with risk reduction, though, everybody plays a part in risk reduction. And this presentation is really about risk reduction, of bringing awareness so that once society has an awareness of this problem, we can work towards trying to eliminate it, or at least creating a society in which it's no longer tolerated. So with that said, I've given you a lot of statistics about reporting. It's good to talk about why people aren't reporting, specifically victims who have a disability. One of the factors that it's a barrier to reporting is that there are unprotective organizational structures. What does that mean? That means that we've created spaces for people with disabilities in which organizations kind of dictate how they are to act. We have a lot of socialization that if you're told by a caregiver to go here and to do this, and if you do everything that you were told, you become a good person. We socialize a lot of people with disabilities to be compliant. And because they are socialized to be compliant, that makes them a target. And often, we believe that everybody comes to this work out of love and gratitude and wanting to give and care for those in need. But oftentimes, if you have situations of caregiver fatigue, there is no support organizationally for those caregivers, and there's also not a lot of accountability. This is something that we need to change, and it's going to take a while. Another barrier to reporting is because since the perpetrators are so close to their victims, remember that 97 to 99% number for people with developmental disabilities, because they have such a close relationship to that person, that's a barrier to reporting. So statistically, we find that a lot of times it's caregivers that are the perpetrators of rape and sexual assault on victims who have disabilities. So if you are dependent upon that person to provide for your welfare, for your food, your care, you're not going to want to report on that person because you need them to survive. I do a lot of trainings with People First groups within the state, and we always are reminding them that, you can fire your caregivers, but I think we get so used to that caregiver role that it seems more that the client is serving the caregiver rather than the caregiver serving the client. So we always have to remind people in People First groups that, no, you really do have the control over who is taking care of you and how they are doing that. Another thing that we see play out a lot is that the perpetrator is telling their victim that they're friends and that this is part of their secret and this is how that you show love and affection. And if you want to ensure that that perpetrator still remains your friend, you're not going to tell on them. You don't want them to get into trouble. One thing that came out of that 2007 Rape in Utah report is that the biggest barrier for the entire community to reporting rape and sexual assault was that at the time they were too young to understand that a crime had occurred. And this is often something that we see in this population of people with disabilities, is that they are unaware that a crime has occurred. They are isolated, so they have no one to actually really talk about to see if this is an okay thing or not. And then there's also a lack of knowledge and resources, and definitely a lack of sex education for this population. And a lot of that lack of knowledge or resources and education has nothing to do with it not being there. It's really family members and caregivers trying to be protective of that person and hoping that if you don't tell them information on what healthy sexuality is, or what areas of the body are okay and not okay to touch, that if you don't tell them that information, that it'll never happen. It's actually a risk factor for them if they have no information about sex education, what is good touch, what is bad touch, what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. So I understand wanting to keep people safe, but this is a situation in which denying information is not keeping people safe. Another thing that comes out is that victims don't know how to tell. They may not actually have the words and the vocabulary to do that, and they don't know who to tell. So when we're doing work with the People First groups, we have a training which I lovingly refer to as the Name That Body Part training. And it's this incredibly uncomfortable and embarrassing part of the training population. And this is actually 4 hours of teaching People First advocates how to recognize different types of abuse, keeping their money and stuff safe, to keeping them safe from emotional harm, from neglect, from physical abuse, and then we round it up with sexual abuse. And part of that whole process of naming the body parts is to actually give them the names. Because if someone is trying to report to law enforcement and they're using a word that law enforcement has absolutely no idea what that could mean, referring to their own genitalia, that's going to be difficult and a communication barrier. So it's important to get that information out. And communication issues in general are a problem, especially when you're working with law enforcement. And we do a lot of law enforcement training as well at UCASA, specifically around working with people who have disabilities, because there's this idea that if they can't communicate how I'm used to communicating, then they can't communicate with me at all. And you have to think outside of the box with communication issues. We have different tools at our office that I can make available to the Utah Parent Center that are visual tools that law enforcement or anybody else can use to actually get information out of, and I'll actually have a couple examples of some of those tools a little bit later. The last two barriers to reporting that I have listed on this PowerPoint is something that is a problem with all victims of sexual violence. The first one is fearing that they won't be believed. We do a lot of what we call victim blaming in our society. It's that idea that if that person hadn't been there, if they hadn't had that drink, if they hadn't worn that outfit, that this horrible crime wouldn't have happened to them. And we know ultimately that will make no difference, because the only person that can prevent the rape and sexual assault from happening is the rapist themselves. But for the majority of people, it's easier to go through that checklist and to say, well, this wouldn't have happened to me because I wouldn't have put myself here. I wouldn't have done that. I wouldn't have worn that. I wouldn't have spoken to this person. And what that turns into is blaming the victim for what happened to them. Why didn't they see? Why didn't they understand? How come they couldn't change it? When really, we have to be putting that blame on the perpetrator. And no one wants to go into the mind of a perpetrator. No one wants to actually think about what a perpetrator is thinking when they're willingly objectifying somebody and hurting them. So it's a lot easier as humans to victim blame. And victims are blaming themselves. So if they're already saying all these things to themselves, it's hard enough for them to go and report to someone, because if they're fearing that that person's not going to believe them either, that makes it that much harder to speak out. And this is something we talk a lot about when I'm doing that presentation with People First groups, is shame. It's embarrassing to talk about sexual topics. I cannot tell you how many times I've blushed doing a training, and I've been doing this for several years. It's hard to talk about this. And the level of shame that victims feel is a huge barrier. So, as an ally, as someone who may come in contact at one point with a victim in your lifetime, how do you help them overcome their barriers to reporting, their ability to speak about what happens? And part of that is creating a safe place for that discussion to happen. So we have a list of the things to say and the things not to say. So the first thing to say to create a safe place is to say that I believe you. It doesn't matter what the details are. They need to be believed, and they need to know that you're there to support them through what they're going through. If they're safe, tell them that they're safe. Don't tell them they're safe if that's not true. Let them know that you're sorry that this happened, that you're glad that they're talking with you, that they're here with you now, and let them know that this is not their fault. There is no rapeable offense. There is nothing a victim can ever do to warrant what's happened to them. Victims have the reaction to sexual violence goes this huge emotional gambit. We have seen just about everything conceivable. So let them know that whatever reaction they're having is common and that they're not going crazy. And it's always good to let them know that things will never be the same. This is not a situation in which you can move past it and it never happened. When these acts of violence happen to us, they become part of us, and how we heal after that really depends on the support systems that we have. So let them know that things will never be the same, but that they're going to get better. Now, on the list that we have of things not to say, and a lot of these things are well-meaning. They're said with the best of intentions, but they come out horrifically wrong. So first of all, never ever say, why would someone do anything like that to you? And we tell that a lot when we work with law enforcement, because there's this idea in our brain that we would never ever want to see a person with a disability hurt. How could someone conceivably hurt somebody who is vulnerable but wonderful and loving and part of our lives? Never ever ask a victim to understand why a perpetrator did this to them, because then they're going to start wondering what they did to make that happen. Don't tell a victim ever that you understand, because even if you are a victim of sexual assault yourself, you're never going to understand what that individual person is going through. Also, don't say things such as, I know it's not your fault, but you really shouldn't have been blank. So I have a coworker who is a sexual assault nurse examiner, and I'll tell a couple of her stories throughout this presentation. And she had an instance where she was working with a 16-year-old girl who had gone to a party and was sexually assaulted. And she had her mother come with her to the rape exam, which was very unusual in itself. And as the young girl was out in the dressing room taking off all of her clothing because they had to collect all of that for evidence, the mother said to my coworker, I understand that this is not her fault, but if she wasn't living this lifestyle she is, this wouldn't have happened to her. And my coworker luckily was able to talk to this mother outside of her daughter overhearing, and she said, please tell me you didn't tell your daughter that. And she said, well, I did, but she was really mad. I don't understand why, because she shouldn't have been at that party. And luckily my coworker was able to talk with the mom and explain to her that what happened was not her daughter's fault. And when you include a but statement in any sort of thing of it's not your fault, but it comes out as victim blaming. You don't need to worry about why the perpetrator did this or what risk factors happened after the fact. You need to be there to support and love the person that you're with. Don't ever tell anybody that they're lucky that it could have been worse, because that doesn't help anyway either. Don't tell them not to worry, it's going to be all right, because it isn't all right. And in order to heal, people actually do need to feel that horrible crisis and all that emotion to get that out. When people suppress that, that blocks their healing process. And ultimately, we want people to be able to heal and grow and mature from this process. And of course, don't ever tell anybody who's already in crisis and upset to calm down and try to relax, because you're going to have the exact opposite effect. So the next kind of section that we have here is talking about consent and coercion. And when we talk about rape and sexual assault, consent is really at the heart of the issue. So consent basically means agreeing to something. And that can be verbally, that can be someone saying yes, or it can be nonverbal, it can be in body language, it can be in not participating. There's lots of ways that we can say yes and lots of ways that we can say no. It's important to note that consent can be taken away at any time. So, and it doesn't mean that if you consent to one thing that it means you consent to all things. So if you have a situation in which you've consent to first base, so to speak, it doesn't mean you're going to make a home run. There's also a myth out there that there's this point of no return when it comes to sex. And I can tell you that any set of parents that have been surprised in a moment with their kids coming into the room know that you can stop at any time. And when you think about it, if you imagine two teenagers on the couch and the parents come home, can you imagine one of them saying, "Excuse me, sir, but I'm not done yet"? We know that's not going to happen. So consent can be taken away at any time, no matter where you are within that process. Consent is really establishing boundaries. And as we're doing this work, and as you're working with people in your lives who are within the population of people with disabilities, when you're teaching them about their boundaries and how to establish their boundaries, you need to remember that you also have to respect and encourage and honor their boundaries through this process as well. When we work with consent issues, we also work with consent's opposite, which is coercion. So it's easy enough to say and do practices and training situations where people can say no in different ways. But that's not how coercion works, because most of the time, if you're in a situation where you have a perpetrator who's going to coerce their victim into saying yes, there is an element of not listening to the first no or the second no. We did have a situation in which a young girl was getting her exam done, and she just kept rocking back and forth saying, "Oh, I said no, but then I said yes, and this is my fault." And my coworker at the time had stopped her and asked her more about what the situation was. And apparently the girl had said no quite a few times. And she asked the girl to count up how many times she'd actually told her perpetrator no, that she did not want to do this. And she counted 31 times. 31 times that she had said no, and that person didn't believe her. 31 times until she was finally so worn down that she had to say yes. And even then, that yes legally is not consent. It's coercion. So in order to kind of show the different ways that you can coerce someone, and I have a listing here on our PowerPoint. You can use persuasion, blame, put downs, guilt, power, pressure, blackmail, threats. There's all these different ways of coercing someone, but the best way to show is actually do this sketch that we call, which I call the pen sketch. When I do this particular sketch with people with disabilities, I have a tendency not to have them give me a pen back, but I try to take something that is theirs. And the process of this is I take a very willing and brave volunteer to come up, and I instruct them that they have to say no to however I ask them. And so when I last did this presentation, we were at a People First group in Ogden, a very brave volunteer, and the goal was that I wanted her keys that she wore in a lanyard around her neck. And the idea was that I needed her keys so that I could use the bathroom. And at first I was like, "Can I have your keys?" She said, "No." I said, "No, I really need your keys. I need to go to the bathroom." She said, "I'm sorry, but I can't let you into my house." And so I kept asking, and I found different ways. And I started saying things like, well, aren't you my friend? And her response was, well, yes, you're my friend, but I can't give you my keys. And I'm like, well, I don't understand why you can't give me your keys. Are you not my friend? Because friends would let me have their keys. And you could see that she was really struggling with the fact that she wanted to say yes because she wanted us to remain friends. At one point, I actually said to her, if you don't give me your keys, I'm going to tell everybody that you did anyway, and then they're going to think you're a liar. And this was the first time I thought she was actually going to punch me. And I had really hit on it for her because she was ready to give me the keys. And if I hadn't told her ahead of time that she could not say yes to me, she would have done it. I've had other people in the audience give me whatever I've been asking as I've been going through this process. And while it's a painful exercise for the very brave volunteer up there, it's very instructive to show that there are different ways to encourage people to say yes, to force them to say yes. So even if it's threatening to hurt an animal, or threatening to hurt a family member, or saying that I'm going to tell everybody that you did or didn't, that we're not going to be friends, that, I guess it's true that you really do have low self-esteem, or I guess it's true, all of these other things that people kind of internalize. We all have trigger words, and perpetrators who use coercion are very, very good at finding those trigger words and being able to use those to their advantage. So moving back to consent in general, it's important to know what legally is consent and what is not within the state of Utah. So in the state of Utah, a person may not be able to legally consent if they're expressing a lack of consent through words or their conduct. They cannot consent if they are overcome through physical force or violence or by surprise. They cannot legally consent if they're threatened or someone that they care about is threatened with retaliation. In fact, we had one victim come up to us one day, and this was just a general training we were doing, and all she said was that her perpetrator had threatened to kill her dog. And that was why she had said yes. And she at that time just needed the validation of knowing that she didn't give in to that person. She was trying to protect somebody else. A person may not be able to consent if they are unconscious, if they are unaware that the act is occurring, or if they are physically unable to resist. They also may not be able to consent if they have a mental disease or defect that makes them incapable of appraising the nature of or resisting the act. Now, this does not mean that a person who classifies as a vulnerable adult cannot consent to sex, but it does put a protection in the law if they are unable to understand really what's going on and resist the act. Person may not be able to consent if they are administered a substance like drugs or alcohol. Person cannot consent to sex if the other person is a parent, a step-parent, an adoptive parent, a legal guardian, or if they have a special position of trust, such as being a healthcare professional, a religious counselor, or even a teacher. So the law actually says that there are certain situations in which a person cannot consent to a particular person. Additionally, the law also states that if a person is younger than 14, they cannot consent to any sexual activity, nothing. So if you have a 13-year-old who really feels that they're wise in the ways of the world and is kissing somebody or is making out with somebody a lot older than they are, they actually can't legally consent. And that's one of the few places in the law where it is an age-based, this is what you can and cannot consent to. Between the ages of 14 to 18, a teenager can consent to some sexual activity, but it depends on the activity, and it also depends on the age of the other person participating. So, as a general guideline, a teenager who is 14 to 15 can consent to oral sex, some heavy petting, and then if you're from 16 to 17 can consent to intercourse, but it also depends on the age of the other person, and the laws change a lot. So it's always good to kind of double check, either looking on the legislative webpage to see what the newest laws are, or just to call your local law enforcement to see what they are. Now, when we go into schools and talk about what you can and cannot consent to, We don't go into the details of what legally teenagers can and cannot consent to because we do not want to be held responsible for a teenager going, well, I can do this and I can do this, but I can't do this. And so that's not part of what we do when we go out and do trainings in the community. So moving on from consent, we have to talk about how abuse starts. So what you're seeing on your screen right now is called a power and control wheel. And it's a nice tool to use to actually talk about different types of abuse and how they manifest, because especially when you're dealing with long-term relationships where the abuse started small and then it keeps getting progressively worse, it's hard to actually, if you're in the middle of that relationship, be able to see everything that's going on. So there's power control wheels for a lot of different types of populations. This one is specific for people with disabilities and their caregivers. There's also an equality wheel, and I will make both available to the Utah Parent Center so that you can download and look at these later. But oftentimes when we talk about sexual violence or just domestic violence in general, we seem to think that hitting somebody, especially when we're talking about domestic violence, that hitting somebody is all that that violence is. That's only about 20% of what happens within domestic violence or any sort of an abusive relationship. Just as with a relationship that has sexual violence in it, that the physical sex part is only a small component of the whole. So here are some different abuse things that you will see in relationships that are very, very negative. So for example, intimidation. You don't have to raise a hand to someone in order to get them to be compliant. And I know from personal experience, my mother had this look that when I did something wrong could melt the skin off my face. So, and we all have those moments when we get this look from a parent. So you can imagine that in an abusive situation, a look can mean a lot more than a look. So any sort of intimidation, anything that creates fear, even if that's destroying someone's property, if that means abusing pets, or displaying mistreating service animals, even showing a weapon can be a form of intimidation. Emotional abuse is another component that we come across. So that's bullying behavior, ridiculing someone, refusing to speak to them, ignoring requests, attacking what's at the core of that person, be their religion, their personal taste, their tradition, and even making fun of them for what their disability is. That is a form of emotional abuse. Isolation is another issue that we have that's not only controlling access to friends, family, and neighbors, but that's controlling access to communication, to the phone, to the TV. We have instances of limiting employment because the caregiver doesn't want to have to do the driving to wherever the client's place of employment is. Or the person who is the abuse perpetrator making sure that, or telling their victim, well, you shouldn't be contacting your case manager, you shouldn't be talking to an advocate, you don't need that. Another element we have is minimizing, justifying, and blaming. And this happens both on the victim side and on the perpetrator side. So it's the idea that the abuse really isn't that bad, or they're really, they're just going crazy and that just has nothing to do, this is all overblown. Or the victim saying, they really do love me, it's okay. Withholding, misuse, or delay of needed supports. So instances where a caregiver may sedate a client in order just to make it easier to deal with them that day. Ignoring safety equipment requirements, breaking or not fixing adaptive equipment, destroying communication devices, withholding medication, using the equipment or just the care itself to immobilize the person. So saying that the person, a caregiver decides, I'm not actually going to transfer you out of your bed into your wheelchair today because I don't want to deal with you. That is a form of abuse and neglect. We also have economic abuse, which is taking away the choice of that person's financial aspects, but also, stealing from them, taking their property, not allowing them to make decisions, or not even allowing them to see what their balance is. The next kind of level area that we have is caregiver privilege, and privilege is a difficult topic to cover in general, but when you have caregiver privilege that is coming into a relationship of abuse, it manifests as the caregiver treating their client as a servant, as a child, just making decisions for them no matter what, and completely discounting what that client wants to say, wants to have happen. It's limiting the client's roles, their responsibilities, and also providing care in a way that's accentuating that person's dependence and their vulnerability. And also discouraging them from fully living and going through their life. And the last section that we have is coercion and threats, which is, pretty standard. It's threatening to hurt the person or withholding care items, threatening to terminate the relationship. We're no longer going to be friends, or to leave that person alone and unattended. That is a huge method of control that we see. Now, what I don't have in this particular PowerPoint is the equality wheel. And the factors that play in an equality wheel is the ideal that you want in your situation, which is fairness negotiation, non-threatening behavior, having dignity and respect, encouraging involvement not only with the person with their choices, their lives, their family, having honesty and accountability, responsible provision of services, economic equality, and choice and partnership. And for many of you, I'm sure that this next slide is the real reason why you're here, which is the signs and symptoms of abuse in people with disabilities. So you'll see here that we have some pictures on this particular screen, and these are actually screenshots taken from a communication guide that we have. So, and I have a couple more examples of those throughout here. For signs and symptoms, what you want to look at, and there's another handout that I'll have available to you that kind of goes a little bit deeper into this list. When you're looking at signs and symptoms of abuse, you want to look for a noticeable change in behavior that takes place over time. So when we talk about physical signs, sometimes the physical signs are pretty immediate, which is difficulty in walking or sitting, torn or bloody underclothing, bruises or bleeding in the genital area, or pain or itching. There's medical issues that may also present a little bit quicker than some of the other changes in behavior that you might see, such as pregnancy, sexually transmitted infections, ulcers, unexplained stomach aches, or frequent urinary tract infections. And oftentimes when you have, you see this a lot with children who are victims, the stomach aches, with anything when your torso, inside your torso hurts, it all seems to say it's a stomach ache, but it's all in that whole area. It's that trying to protect your core to keep yourself safe. Changes in social behavior that you might see that would indicate that there could be something at play here that you need to look a little bit further in is an increase in aggression where there wasn't aggression before. An increase in non-compliance, or if you have a person who's a little bit, I'm not going to listen to what you say, all of a sudden turn into, I'm going to do anything you say and I'm not going to argue. That's a sign something has changed. There's a change in sleeping patterns, sleeping too much, sleeping too little, nightmares, might starting to hurt themselves, cutting, suicidal behaviors, exhibiting temper control problems where there wasn't any before. If you have someone who was pretty even mood-wise and they're changing and going from angry to sad to happy in a very short period of time, and that's new, that's an indication that something else is at play. Changes in living skills could include changes in eating habits, so eating too much, not eating enough, or if someone develops pica, that could be a change in living skills. Violating other people's property, which is something that we see a lot in cases where we have perpetrators who also have a disability, and group home situations is most common, where that person who was the perpetrator at one point was a victim, and that's how they believe that love is expressed, and so they start by not respecting other people's boundaries, and then they start with the actual abuse themselves. So it's a cycle that kind of perpetuates itself within this community. And different sort of performance or social skills deterioration might also indicate a change. Changes in emotional behavior, touch phobia where there was no touch phobia before, discomfort with eye contact, if that's something different than how that particular disability manifests. Difficulty sleeping, nightmares, loss of affect, which is the facial expression. So if you had someone who used to be very expressive in their face and all of a sudden they have a really kind of no facial expression at all, that could also be a sign that there's something going on. Other emotional behavior changes is depression, suicide, a change in leisure habits, a change in sexual expression, or displays of sophisticated sexual behavior where you have no idea where that came from before. Unusual sexual behavior is another indicator. Talking about sexual issues in highly public places, possibly acting out sexually against other people is another indicator. A fearful reaction to sex education materials. Now this one's a little bit odd in how it's presented, because when I do our Name That Body Part presentation for our People First groups, I get a lot of reactions of, oh, I can't believe you just said that, oh, don't point at that. And a lot of that is beyond kind of like the giggling of, he, she's pointing to a boob, right? So when you have someone who has a fearful reaction to sex education materials, I would really look at that as if they have already had some sort of exposure to it, you've had that discussion, and then all of a sudden they really, really, really don't want to talk about it, that could be an indicator that there's something going on. And then we've also had a case where, especially when the victim is very close to the perpetrator, and if they're reporting or they're going in for medical attention and that caregiver or the perpetrator is there with them, they might falsely accuse somebody else in order to get the services that they need and still protect the perpetrator. It's kind of the best of two bad choices, really. It's, I still have my caregiver there, they're not going to hurt me, but I'm also still getting this extra care. So that's something else that has happened before. And we work a lot with law enforcement to talk about different ways of questioning, of establishing timelines, so that we can get the right information and make sure that that victim is not protecting their perpetrator. And then the last mark that we have on here is indicators of incest. And I included this in here because oftentimes there is that close relationship between the victim and the perpetrator. So sometimes these things come into play. And then also any of these signs and symptoms I have listed are also really good indicators of child sexual abuse in general, because you have to look for that behavior change over time. So for indicators of incest, we have a marked role reversal between a parent and a child. So when the child starts doing more parenting than the parent is, that could be a sign that there's something going on in the household. And not necessarily that it is sexual abuse, but any sort of abuse or some sort of negative situation happening in the household. An overreaction by the parent to for the child receiving sex education. And even beyond that level of, I want to protect them, they don't ever need to know this because I don't ever want them to have, sexual relations or be hurt that way. You still need to give that information out. Excessive absences from school, inconsistent parenting between children, so if one child gets a whole lot of extra attention and the others don't. Extreme protectiveness, extreme jealousy, alcoholism or drug abuse within the family, social or geographic isolation, or over control by one of the parental figures. So that's a lot of kind of signs and symptoms, and that's why hopefully you will be able to get onto the UPC website and actually download those signs and symptoms to look at. They're a good indicator to have. So we get to the point where we understand the signs and the symptoms, but what do we do from there on? The real question is to report or not to report. There's a belief out there, and we've actually seen this documented in the Rape in Utah report, that there's a distrust of law enforcement to prosecute and adequately act when these cases are brought before them. Well, that should not be a reason why you don't report. That's one of the reasons why UCASA is out doing the work that we're doing with these different agencies and organizations to make it a place that is safer for victims to report in general. However, we need to be said that the victim has the right to control over this process. This was their victimization. This is their story. They need to be the ones to control that, because that's giving them back control in a situation where control was completely taken away from them. It's very important for the healing process. However, there are times where mandatory reporting is going to come into play. And if you are in the situation in which someone has disclosed to you and it's a mandatory reporting situation, you need to be able to explain why legally you have to report. First of all, not reporting in a mandatory reporting situation does mean criminal charges against you. It's a Class B misdemeanor. It's a pretty small misdemeanor, but it's starting to be charged more to bring awareness out to the fact that these are situations in which reporting needs to happen. Mandatory reporting laws can be really kind of confusing and overwhelming, so I try to simplify it as much as possible in this situation. But if you ever have a question, you can always contact your local law enforcement officer or contact the 24-hour rape and confidential rape and sexual assault crisis line, and that number is 1-888-421-1100. And when you call that number, it'll automatically geolocate to the nearest rape crisis program you're at, which is kind of helpful. So if you're, say, in Richfield, you'll go to the Richfield shelter, which is New Horizons, and you'll be talking to them. So you'll be able to talk to people from your local community in order to really find out what the resources are that are available. If you're in a situation in which you're questioning whether to report and the incident has just happened and that person needs to go to the hospital, advise them not to bathe or to douche. If there's any oral contact, don't have them smoke, eat, or drink, or brushing teeth, because that all could destroy evidence. And they don't have to worry about when we bring clients in for the CODAR exams, which is the rape exams, we don't just have them sit there for hours and hours and hours with no food. So if they're hungry, what we're going to do is we're going to take oral swabs first, and then we're going to allow them to eat and drink. But we want to be able to get that evidence first before we allow that. So situations in which you must report. If the victim is under age 14, no matter whether they consented or not, you report it. And depending on the activity that the victim is saying, if they're between ages 14 and 18, even if they say it was consensual or not, there are times where you're going to need to report. And that 14 to 18 range, that's where it gets really kind of confusing. If the victim is 60 years old and is residing in a care facility and they're reporting non-consensual activity, you must report. If the victim is 65 or older and they're reporting non-consensual activity, you must also report. And if the victim has a disability, as defined by the Utah Law Code, making them a vulnerable adult, and they are reporting non-consensual activity, you have to report. So I'm sure most of you are probably pretty familiar with the vulnerable adult statute and what classifies as a vulnerable adult, but just to quickly kind of go over that. You must report if you believe that there is a vulnerable adult who is being subjected to abuse, neglect, or exploitation of any kind. So a vulnerable adult is a person who is 65 years of age or older, or an adult who has a mental and physical impairment which substantially affects that person's ability to provide personal protection, provide necessities such as food, shelter, clothing, or mental or other health care, for them to obtain services necessary for health, safety, or welfare, to carry out their activities of daily living, to manage their own adult resources, or to comprehend the nature and consequences of remaining in the situation of abuse, neglect, or exploitation. When you're reporting on adults, you're not mandated to report non-consensual activity if the person is between that 18 to 60, 65 age, if it's non-consensual, unless they are a vulnerable adult, and then you have to report if they're saying that it is non-consensual. We have had situations in which someone has felt that it was non-consensual, and in fact it was. We actually had a case of a mother who had a daughter in her 20s who had a developmental disability who was engaged to be married, and she had premarital sex with her fiance, and her mother was not happy with this and reported to her local law enforcement officer that she felt that her daughter was raped. Law enforcement, seeing that this was a particular situation where they're like, oh, this person has a disability, I don't know how to deal with it, they never actually interviewed the alleged victim. and what ended up happening was on the court, on the court stand, on the witness stand, these particular law enforcement officers basically got their butts handed to them by the defense. And what came out of that was, in fact, that this young girl did consent, and she understood what she was doing, and she was very happily participating with her fiance in this. And it was really the mom that was being upset about this. And this was a situation in which, while the mom may have not known that the daughter had understand fully, it was also a situation in which law enforcement didn't really understand the issues either. So this is one of those times when UCASA can be called in to actually work with and develop the situation. And when I was working with these law enforcement officers, they had wanted me to give them a checklist of how to determine if someone was competent enough to make decisions for themselves. And they were not happy with me when I refused to give them such a list, because one does not exist. And I think anybody who is close with someone who has a disability, especially someone who has a developmental disability, we are surprised on a daily basis on the strength, the resiliency, and how much these individuals really know and get the world. So there's a level of sometimes being overprotective is not helping, it's actually harming. So if you suspect abuse, contact the authorities immediately. And you can do that in a variety of ways. You can contact Adult Protective Services. We have their number listed here in this PowerPoint. Or you can call the Child Protective Services or the Child Abuse Hotline. Or you could contact your local law enforcement. Now, if you contact law enforcement, they have to notify Adult Protective Services and Child Protective Services. If you contact Adult Protective Services and Child Protective Services, they also have to contact law enforcement. So you don't have to call them all. You just have to call one, and everybody else will be notified. You can also, if you have questions or to see if this really is a situation in which you need to mandatorily report, you can always call the 24-hour Sexual Assault Crisis and Information Line. And I also have listed in this PowerPoint for you the statewide domestic violence link line, which is also an information line based off of, that focuses more on issues that are strictly pertaining to domestic violence. The other thing that you can do when you suspect abuse and are reporting is to have some patience with this process. If you go the legal route, it can be long, can be drawn out, and sometimes you don't get the resolution that you want, or that the family wants, or that the victim wants. And you have to understand that justice looks different for every single individual, and every single victim is going to respond differently to what their idea of justice is. Don't assume that the caregiver should be called. We do a lot of training with law enforcement about understanding that, yes, it may be easier for the caregiver to be the one who is interpreting, for example, but if you have the case where the caregiver is the perpetrator, you're not going to be getting accurate information. You're actually going to be continuing that cycle of violence. Always believe the victim. Don't question accuracy. That's not your job. Leave that to law enforcement. You are there to support and love the person that you were with. Make sure to validate the victim's feelings and let them know that you see that this is a courageous act, that they have come forward to you, and honor that. Let them know that they're not alone, that you are there to support them, and empower them. This is perhaps the number one thing anybody can do for a survivor of rape and sexual assault, is to help them be able to make their decisions again. They've had their control, they've had their decision-making possibilities taken away from them in a very cruel way. So the best place to start healing is by helping them get back their own voice. So as we're nearing towards the end of this presentation, we're going to go back and talk a little bit more about rape myths, because this is also something that comes into play when we're working with victims. So there's this idea that there's really only a real rape, or if you listen to media, you hear terms like legitimate rape, or gray rape, or rape. Rape is rape, and anybody who tries to use the word to diminish its impact is really doing a disservice for the entire movement. I had a neighbor who was on the phone with his friend. He was talking about playing a video game, and his response was, I guess he won, but how he put it was, "I totally raped that guy." And I actually had a conversation with him afterwards, because I was like, look, you just won the game. You shouldn't be using that word in that particular context because it takes out the power of really how horrible a crime that rape is. So I want you to remember that there is no such thing as a real rape, and oftentimes people think that rape only occurs when it's committed by a stranger. Well, we know that nationally, only 90% of rape victims know their perpetrator. In Utah, for the general population, it's 87% know their perpetrator. And for a person who has a developmental disability, 97% know their perpetrator. This is not strangers doing this. Rapists are fathers, their grandfathers, husbands, brothers, uncles, neighbors, boyfriends, their mothers, their sisters, their friends, their partners, people that we know and people that we trust. I don't want anybody to think that this is a situation in which all men are bad, because that's not the case at all. And this is not a situation where, oh yes, well, women can be perpetrators too, so we shouldn't focus on one or another. It doesn't matter what the gender of the rapist is. We need to make sure that these people are stopped and that they're living in a society in which they are held accountable for what they do. We always need to remember that rape is rape, regardless of who perpetrates it. There's also a myth of the typical rape, which is that there's a weapon involved and it's, there's this long drawn out, a gun to someone's head or whatever. We always need to remember that we don't actually have physical weapons the majority of time when there's a rape or sexual assault that occurs. We often forget that words are perhaps the most deadly of weapons. You can spend an entire lifetime building up someone's self-esteem and tear that down with one sentence. So you're not going to find a traditional or a typical rape with a weapon like that. You're also not going to find a situation where a victim who, is going to fight and scream to get away from their perpetrator. If your perpetrator is someone that you know and trust, you're not going to throat punch them. Let's be honest about that. And there's also situations in which people are incapable of fighting and screaming. We've heard of the fight or flight response, but there's also a freeze response. And the freeze response happens when the body is trying to protect itself. Think of it as an animal caught in the headlights where they freeze and you think that they should run, but there's that split second where they're trying to figure out what to do. When somebody freezes in an assault, that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to figure out what to do, and oftentimes the best thing to do is to dissociate from your body and not be there and not move. But later on, because people expect that those that don't want to be raped will fight and scream, it's also used as a way to blame that victim for what happened to them. There's also the idea that rape only occurs in places where the victim shouldn't have been anyway. And I didn't bring any statistical evidence about that, but there is a large proportion of rapes and sexual assaults that happen in people's own homes. They can happen anywhere, and there's no way that you can say you shouldn't be here, this is going to happen to you. The reality check of the situation is there's no such thing as a typical rape. Each person will react differently to their assault. Rapists are going to be targeting those that are vulnerable and those who they believe that others will not believe. We have to remember that it's never the victim's fault. Never, ever, ever the victim's fault. There may be some risky behaviors. There may be, somebody putting themselves in maybe a dangerous situation, but there is no offense that justifies someone raping another person. There is no situation anybody asks for it, asks to be raped or sexually assaulted. We always have to remember that we need to put the blame where it has to go, which is on the person responsible for the sexual violence, which is the rapist. And that is the only person that can actually prevent any of this from happening. Now, we have some myths and facts about sexual violence specific to people with disabilities. And this is where I sometimes get in trouble with parents because they think I'm a little bit too liberal. Sometimes these things can be hard to hear. And I hope that you will take it for what it's worth for some of the things I'm about to say, because for some it's very difficult. Myth: that a person with a disability is a child in an adult's body. The reality is that they're an adult in all respects, including their own sexual feelings and desires. This is why I make a big issue when we talk about when you have to report when it's consensual and non-consensual, because this is an issue, just as in that story I told earlier of the mother disagreeing with her daughter's actions and reporting it. This needs to be considered. Myth: that a person with a disability is innocent. and they should stay that way, and they don't need to know about sex. The reality is that they have a right to know about healthy sexuality, and they have a right to know about that because that can help but reduce their risk of sexual abuse and sexual assault in the long run. This will actually protect them more than not letting them have this access to this information. Myth. If they're claiming to be sexually abused, they're making it up to seek attention. First of all, speaking up about sexual abuse is a tremendous act of encouragement. It's embarrassing, it's hard, it's gut-wrenching, and that should be honored and believed. There's a perception that there's a lot of false reporting out there, and according to the FBI, there's only a 3 to 6% rate of false reports when we're talking about rape and sexual assault. That is actually no higher than the false reporting rate for any type of crime. And that rate also includes instances where people have recanted. And oftentimes when someone recants, it's because they don't want to cooperate with law enforcement, or especially in cases of where they know the perpetrator, they're trying to protect the perpetrator in some way or another. So that number is also included into that 3 to 6%. And additionally, the CODAR exam, the rape exam, is the longest exam you'll ever have in your entire life, and probably the most evasive. They can last anywhere from 2 to 8 hours, depending on the injuries. There's a lot of medical history taken, there's a lot of photographs taken, there's a lot of swabs taken that you just don't want to know where they go. No one who is faking it is going to willingly go through that exam. Another myth. If the person cannot communicate in traditional ways, they can't tell you that they've been sexually abused, which is completely false. If a person cannot communicate in regular ways, they can tell you that they're hungry, they can tell you that they're sad. You just have to watch. You have to pay attention to their body, their face, their emotions for the signs. And a victim can always disclose sexual harm or trauma, and there's always going to be a way to communicate with them to actually get the details and to find that out. Myth. If the person has a history of lying, you should not believe them when they disclose. And I've had a couple parents bring this up to me, saying, well, this person cries wolf all the time, why would I ever believe them? And if you think in the way that a perpetrator does, and you're looking for someone who's very vulnerable, and you're looking for a lot of opportunity, the person that has a history of lying is your perfect target, because who is going to believe them? You've probably seen other people discount what they have to say anyway. It's a great target that actually puts them at a higher risk. Myth. If the person experiences sexual violence, they must have done something to cause it. Again, there is nothing ever that a victim can do to cause their sexual assault to happen, and sexual violence is never the survivor's fault. Myth. Because they have a disability, they can never be a credible witness. And we know that with the right support and accommodations, anyone can tell their story in court. And with some of the collaborative groups that I am working with, we do training with law enforcement about how to work on communication issues, to have them think out of the box. We do the same with court personnel, lawyers, judges, also giving them that information to think outside of the box about how to communicate and how to best facilitate better communication in these instances. Myth. They are not reacting to a trauma, they're just acting out or having a behavioral problem. The fact is that they're trying to tell you something with their actions. They're trying to say something is wrong. So don't punish in these situations. Try to listen and find help. They're reaching out to you because they trust you. So work with them. Try to figure out what's going on. Support them. Myth. Because they have a legal guardian, they cannot consent to anything. Even with a legal guardian, someone still has the right to speak for themselves, and the laws do back this up. And our last myth is if they experience sexual violence, it's usually with a complete stranger. And we've seen statistically that it's usually a family member or a caregiver who is going to be their perpetrators. So as we kind of wrap up this whole thing, I do want to kind of point out that I don't want to scare everybody with this presentation. I just want you to have a bit more of a realistic outlook on some of the issues and factors that may be in play. And if you ever have any questions, please feel free to contact me at my office. My phone number is here on the screen, which is 801-746-0404. You can always email me with questions, and that's at Debbie, DEBBIE, at UCASA, UCASA.org. We are always available for questions. We can always come in and do trainings. We have a variety of different things. So if you want us to come in and talk to your People First group, we can work with that. If you want us to come in and talk to clergy or community, or even a workspace to talk about some of these issues, we can come and help facilitate that. And yes, I'd really like to thank all of you just for hanging out with me through this entire presentation. And I really want you to kind of come away with this presentation of I've given you information so that you can actually be an activist. You are now part of this anti-sexual violence movement, and we're a growing group, and I'm really excited to have you all here and part of that. So again, thank you.